Donald Trump's long threatened 25% tariffs on Canadian goods are now in effect. He says they are needed to curb migration and drug smuggling. But are his claims accurate? Let's break down the numbers, the trade deficit, and what's really happening at the US Canada border. Starting today, March 4th, imports from Canada and Mexico will face a hefty 25% tariff. Canadian energy products like oil and gas will have a slightly lower 10% tariff. Trump argues that the US has been unfairly subsidizing Canada through trade and that these tariffs will force action on border security. But is this really the case? Let's fact check Trump's key claims about Canada's economy, trade relations, and the northern border. Trump has repeatedly said that Canada relies on the US for 95% of its goods, but official data tells a different story. According to Statistics Canada, only 62.2% of Canada's total imports come from the United States. That's a high number, but nowhere near 95%. University of Toronto economist Joseph Steinberg explains, and I quote, "A lot of what Canadians buy is produced domestically. Even if we look at only imports, the US share is high, but not 95%. End quote. On the flip side, Canada is heavily reliant on the US for exports. 75.9% of Canadian exports go to the US. But that doesn't mean Canada's economy is entirely dependent on American trade. Trump has claimed that the US is losing as much as $250 billion per year in trade with Canada, but official numbers contradict this. At the end of 2024, the US Trade Representative and Census Bureau reported a $63.3 billion trade deficit with Canada, far less than Trump's claim. Meanwhile, Statistics Canada reported that Canada actually had a surplus of 102.3 billion Canadian dollars, which is 70.3 billion dollars with the US. Does that mean the US is subsidizing Canada as Trump claims? Experts say no. Steinberg explains, and I quote, "Trade deficits aren't subsidies. The US buys products from Canada because it sees value in them. That's how international trade works." End quote. One major factor, US oil imports from Canada, which contributes significantly to the trade imbalance. In a social media post, Trump claimed that American banks aren't allowed to do business in Canada. This is false. Canada's Federal Bank Act regulates foreign banks, including US financial institutions. According to the Canadian Bankers Association, 16 US-based banks operate in Canada, holding around 113 billion Canadian dollars in assets. Some of the biggest names include JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America. All have branches in major Canadian cities. Trump's claim that American banks are banned simply doesn't hold up. Trump has warned that large numbers of undocumented migrants and fentanyl are crossing the US-Canada border. But what does the data say? Fentanyl, according to US Customs and Border Protection, out of 21,800 pounds of fentanyl seized in 2024, only 43 pounds came from the Canadian border, less than 1%. Illegal migration. In 2024, CBP agents apprehended 23,721 people crossing from Canada into the US. But compared to the 1.5 million migrants encountered at the Mexico-US border, the northern numbers are tiny. Kelly Sundberg, a criminologist at Mount Royal University in Calgary, explains, and I quote, "Canada is under greater threat from the US than vice versa, whether it's guns, drugs, or illegal migration." End quote. Donald Trump's tariffs and claims about Canada paint a picture of a country dependent on the US and failing to control its borders. But the numbers tell a different story. The US does not have a $250 billion trade deficit with Canada. Canada doesn't get 95% of its products from the US. American banks operate freely in Canada. The northern border is not a major source of drugs, or illegal migration. Trump's latest tariffs will likely escalate tensions between the two countries, but whether they will achieve his stated goals remains to be seen.